Well, I really thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you today. And I see John, an old friend. We served together on the Southern Technology Council, which is an opportunity to get the southern states together to talk about economic growth. I'm here to share with you a story of a positive outcome in Washington, D.C. It's not something you would think about. Everything I'll share with you today has been overwhelmingly bipartisan. Everything is passed into law. Eric Cantor carried one of the bills and said, when I left the White House, hey, we're doing great work for the country. But this is not the stuff you'll hear about. So you might be a little bit caught off guard as the stories I'll share are not the ones you'll read typically in the papers. But it speaks to a broader notion in the country that says if we're going to solve the problems of our day, the idea that we're going to have one ideological view or the other win out in this battle of ideas is going to leave us behind, that the answer is finding a way to invent a better universe, a better future. And our theory is if we can lower the healthcare costs in America but improve quality, we all are supportive of that. If we can find a way to lower the costs of education but ensure that outcomes improve for everyone across all backgrounds, we're all for that. So that's the one part that when I went to the Kennedy School, which you were very kind to note, I was with the dean not too long ago, and I teased him. I said, I was never taught the things that I did at the White House when I was in school. And so what I want to walk you through is sort of this new approach to problem solving, the idea of inventing a better way, and we call that open innovation. Now, just one comment about open innovation. This borrows heavily from the private sector, and I'll give you a couple of examples throughout my remarks, but here's the way I looked at this. The traditional tools of government, as trained to me when I was in school, passing bills and encouraging or increasing investments through the budget. So getting a budget passed or getting a bill passed were the things that we were measured on in terms of output. And what this says is there's another army or arrow in the quiver, and that particular arrow has the concept of public-private partnership at the center. What is it that the government can do to spur or encourage entrepreneurship in the areas that we so desperately need improvement? Now, the center of this story is the president's philosophy of an all-hands-on-deck approach to solving problems. In other words, what I will share with you today has one common theme across 5 disciplines. That while these are Washington discussions, the solutions come from people you would never imagine being part of a Washington answer. So the first one of my stories I'll share with you is just that point. It's the story of Oliver Kuttner and Victor Garcia, 2 individuals that you would not normally think of as part of the American future, especially in manufacturing. Now, I happen to be from Virginia, so these are 2 stories that have a Virginia center, but they're not unique to Virginia. This is the story of entrepreneurs who didn't even know within themselves they had the capacity to solve problems, but they were spurred to action by the use of a new tool in government, that is the use of prizes, challenges, and competition in order to solve problems. So the first example is one that was sponsored by the private sector. Progressive, the insurance company, they sponsored something called the X Prize for a very bold, ambitious goal. Who can achieve a vehicle that performs at 100 miles per gallon over the course of a certain number of distance, a certain distance? You would think that the folks in Detroit would have a monopoly on the best thinking in automotive design and whatnot. Or you would think maybe other global centers that are emerging. But you probably would not be thinking about Lynchburg, Virginia. Have any of you been to Lynchburg, Virginia? You have? Good for you. It's not the place you would think of as being an automotive center of excellence. But what happens in Lynchburg is that we still have a manufacturing center, so you could literally walk down the street and pick up parts. Not everything's yet been outsourced to China. So Oliver Kuttner happens to have been a real estate developer whose buddies used to ride cars at the Virginia International Raceway down the road. And, you know, people would take their personal cars and they'd spin them around the racetrack, and it was a fun hobby. It still is for a lot of folks. They found out about the X Prize and they said, you know what? We have an audacious goal. we will design this with never having experienced or designed a vehicle before. We're going to put a team together. We're going to beat Detroit, anyone else that wants to compete. So because they designed it in Lynchburg, they were able to tinker with parts, and their philosophy was just de-weight the vehicle. They built a working prototype. You can see that pictured next to Oliver, and beat out every other individual in this competition and took home that $5 million prize. But the story of Victor Garcia is even better, because it's the story of what the president's comments about a bottom-up approach to solving problems is all about. Now, for those of you that know the military, you know that we're obviously in a fiscally challenged time. We're going through a difficult period. We're going to be contracting the size of the military at precisely the time when the cost of producing military equipment has never been more expensive. There is a very famous saying that Norm Augustine, a very accomplished leader in the country who ran one of our big defense contracting companies, Norm Augustine called this Augustine's Law. If you plotted the cost of an aircraft carrier from the 50s through today and beyond, it's been taking on a straight line for many, many years. And if you projected it out, by the year 2054, one aircraft carrier will be the entirety of the Defense Department budget. So we don't need a 5% improvement in military productivity for manufacturing. We need like an 80% performance improvement. So DARPA, which is the research and development arm headquartered in Virginia, decided to take this project on. And they decided to do something that they'd never done before: bypass the defense contractors and go straight to the American people. And they said, we're going to offer a $7,500 prize if anybody can design the next best combat support vehicle capable of transporting 2 injured soldiers from the battlefield. That was the requirement. They posted this requirement on Twitter, on Facebook, and they reached 20,000 designers. They gave those designers 3 weeks. It would normally take 3 weeks to change a comma in an RFP at the DoD. So they put out word. Receiving this message was Victor Garcia, an immigrant who came to the country at the age of 5 from Mexico. He wasn't exactly the accomplished young lady who introduced me, just basically finished high school and was a waiter at the Sizzler. But he saw an ad on TV that said, while he was waiting tables, that you can be an automotive designer. So he enrolled in a technical school, and he decided to go on and get that degree. But because his resume wasn't like the most stellar, he ended up as a contract entry-level worker at Peterbilt, the trucking company, Peterbilt. And he was a contract worker, so he didn't have health insurance. And he found out his wife was pregnant. So he was hyper-motivated for money to be able to pay for the health insurance at just the time the contest comes out. So he puts his heart and soul into the deal. And as you can imagine, because I've got him pictured on this slide, he won the competition, received the check. But the story doesn't end with the check, because it's one thing to design it, it's another to build it. So DARPA said, we're not done with just designing it. This happened in about February. He said, we want this built in 4 months. So a company called Local Motors in Arizona said, we'll build it. They'd never met Victor, didn't know his design, just learned it, found it, put it to work, and next thing you know, they went about building that vehicle. I had the unbelievably cool job of picking up the phone and calling DARPA. I said, is there any chance you can get the vehicle to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on June 24th that year? And they said, sure. What do you need it for? And they know not to ask, because you can't really say what those things are about. So we said, just get the vehicle to Pittsburgh. And they did. And why would they want to go to Pittsburgh? I mean, I'm a Steelers fan, so presumably they could have done something football related. The answer is that the President of the United States was announcing a new advanced manufacturing partnership to tap into universities who have great potential to solve our big manufacturing challenges. And in doing so, he wanted to thank personally the team that put together the winning competition. Now, this is a gentleman who would never, you would never pick him out as someone that had a lobbyist or an insider credential or some powerful role. An average Joe, or in this case, an average Victor, who stepped up because he had hidden talent, was motivated, and he put his talents to work. The thesis of everything else I'll share with you rests on the proposition that we have unbelievable hidden potential in every American, And our leaders' jobs are to bring out the very best and to connect them to opportunities so that we can solve problems neighborhood by neighborhood. Here's how we're doing it one by one. We're first changing the rules of the road. We are changing the rules of the road to promote innovation and entrepreneurship. Now, when John and I would gather at the Southern Technology Council, we would have a common lament. Why can't we bring venture capital to our communities? This was the common lament. If you wanted to invest in startups, by law, you had to be an accredited investor. Now, I don't want to embarrass anybody in the room, but here are the conditions. You have to be a multimillionaire. Your income every year has to be at least $500,000 or so, and you have to have some experience. So you could look in the mirror and say, oh yeah, that's me, right? Or you can't, or if it's not you, you cannot participate in the startup economy. So the question is, how are we supposed to find Victor and celebrate people like Victor and invest in people like Victor if only 0.5% of America can participate? So the president called on Congress to simplify the rules. We now, thanks to the introduction you gave me, the power of the internet, we now have more disclosure, more information. We can do more to protect investors. So we should let every American, you and me, contribute up to 5% of our income to put into startups. What this will do is create an unbelievable amount of opportunity to spark that creativity in America, not because some fancy Silicon Valley investor came to Arkansas and said, hey, I'm in it for you, but Arkansas can invest in itself. Fred Wilson, who's one of the most famous venture capitalists in New York, in the country, he estimated the venture capital in the market in the United States is about a $20 billion industry. This is what powers companies like Facebook and Google, and you've heard all these names. 20 billion. But if each of us just put 1% of our income into startups, we could unleash $300 billion of capital, more than tenfold the opportunity. Now, this particular changing the rules road, this is the bill that Eric Cantor sponsored and the president signed into law this past year. There's a lot of work policy students have to focus on to make sure that we implement this it's called crowdfunding. We implement this the right way. But if we do so, we have the potential to really give it a turbo boost to that entrepreneurial economy without us having to go beg the lords of Silicon Valley or Wall Street to come here and solve our problems. This could be an unbelievable tool in the toolkit. And this particular tool sits as one of several that the president had us deploy through the Recovery Act and through other policies to serve as a foundation for long-term economic growth. You're not going to want to read all the details here, but if you go to whitehouse.gov/innovation, you will see the president's strategy for American innovation, which we revealed. It was actually my first trip on Air Force One. It was a very exciting trip. I don't know if you've had the pleasure of going on Air Force One with the president. You know, Bill Clinton took you on there, but you get to pick up the phone, and I called my wife, and she's at home, and the person calls from the military. Will you take a call from Air Force One? I felt very cool that day. But unfortunately, it didn't make a lot of news, this speech, because for some political reason, the president was apparently rumored to be pushing aside Governor Patterson's attempt at running for re-election. So all the papers covered was this he said, she said of politics. And then in like the 8th paragraph below, oh, and by the way, the president gave a speech on America's long-term economic growth, which, whatever. The speech had 3 basic principles. When we invest in our country, we should be investing in the building blocks of innovation. Now, traditionally, it's roadways, railways, and runways, but the president said that's increasingly research and development, it's human capital, people like Victor, and it is digital infrastructure. This is important because the foundation for the rest of what I'll be sharing with you is the spirit of digital infrastructure. That is to say, you can't modernize the healthcare system without digitizing or collecting data on what works and what doesn't. You can't fix education unless you can harness the power of the internet to ensure we know what works and what doesn't. Ditto on our manufacturing sectors. So having infrastructure that is 21st century, a critical element, And by the way, again, in a bipartisan act of Congress, we've put a plan in place called the National Wireless Initiative, which will ensure that the United States remains a leader in mobile broadband for decades to come. And this is an exciting piece of legislation because it makes good on the one thing we never finished on 9/11, which is giving our cops and firefighters access to interoperable communications. Remember, the cops got the message to get out of the towers, but the firefighters did not because they were on a different frequency. Remember that. So the Congress worked this legislation through. Infrastructure is there. In addition to that crowdfunding bill, we've also changed how our patent system works, and we've ushered in new rules to ensure that the internet economy works for everyone. All bipartisan, all signed into law. But last and certainly not least, the President said we need to catalyze breakthroughs in these big areas of national importance. And the tools that I thought we brought to the table, this third leg, if you will, on the policy stool, are described in those 4 bullets under the term Open Innovators Toolkit. We have failed to recognize the power of our government as a data gatherer. The power of opening up government data and inspiring its use is one very important tool in the policymaker's toolkit. Second, we often forget that without having to pass a law or without having to expand our budget, we just convene. We can bring people together a la Clinton Global Initiative and invite folks to share or to solve problems, in this case, to lower barriers to entry in the internet economy by agreeing on technical standards that spark innovation and entrepreneurship. As Victor and Oliver testify, the role that prizes and challenges come to the table as another important leg. We now said in addition to the typical procurements, we can issue these challenges, and Congress gave us freedom to do so up to $50 million. And finally, we noted that it's important for us to celebrate entrepreneurs. You know, the President often notes that in the White House, if you win any sports title, you're guaranteed an invitation to the White House. It's like a thing. And I'm a Steelers fan, so when I first got there, I saw the Steelers after they won the Super Bowl. I was like, man, this is cool. But we are what we celebrate. And so the President said we don't celebrate enough our scientists, our engineers, our innovators. So now he's got the science fair annually at the White House. He's invited entrepreneurs of all stripes. We've launched the Startup America initiative to celebrate entrepreneurs and innovators from all over the country. It's important that we do all 3 of these things in order to spark American economic growth in the next decade and beyond. So let me just give you 5 quick market examples, and then we'll turn to questions if you have any. Let me begin by talking about smarter manufacturing. Smarter manufacturing. How many of you thought that the internet would do something for manufacturing? Any of you think that? A couple of you. Well, let me describe for you exactly how it worked for a small company called Jayco Plastics, based in Indiana. Now, this is the chicken and egg problem. By the way, I don't want to make political commentary here, but I'll just make one observation. This notion that everything in the world gets better if we cut taxes is very old thinking. Because if I haven't sold any products, I have no earnings on which to be taxed. So nothing from nothing leaves nothing, as the big dog said at the convention, arithmetic. So the challenge for a lot of our small business owners is winning those contracts, revenue. But there is a chicken and egg problem, and Jayco Plastics is the embodiment of it. You see, in today's manufacturing operations, there are steel crates that transport very heavy equipment and machinery on the floor. These steel crates are made in China, but they work. Jayco Plastics is an American company that said, we can't compete on price for the steel crate, but we use innovation and entrepreneurship. We have found a plastic substitute that can withstand the weight, is cheaper to produce, and made in America. The problem is no customer would buy it because they said, you have to make it and prove it to us that it can handle the weight. Chicken, egg, chicken, egg. I can't make it if I don't have the contract. He's a 25-person company. So he didn't know what to do. One of the public-private partnerships I really enjoyed working on for the President, there are all these big companies, Procter & Gamble, GE, John Deere. real mainstream, strong American businesses. They've known for decades that computers can help address this question by allowing us to model or simulate performance. And it's good enough for these big companies to use them internally, but the technology is too expensive. It's not accessible for small entrepreneurs. It's like a $100,000 investment just to get one seat license and a couple staff to know what they're doing. So a 25-person company obviously can't make that investment. Chicken, egg. So we did a public-private partnership to say, you know what if we brought all the research assets that we have in this country? And we started out in the Midwest. Purdue University has a website called manufacturinghub.org. The Ohio Supercomputing Center has excess capacity to do high-performance studies. And a whole range of researchers from the National Science Foundation and NIST and others said, we can collaborate too. Well, in not even 6 months, we found a way to reach out to Jayco Plastics, tested out their particular containers, and proved to their customer that they could withstand the weight. They immediately signed a $2.5 million order, allowing them to on-ramp 7 more employees, and that will scale at least 4-fold as they hit certain milestones. The CEO of Jayco Plastics didn't need a tax cut. He needed access to high-performance computing that's too inaccessible today, but as we move down the Moore's Law curve, if you will, can be democratized so that every manufacturer in America has access to this really, really important innovation. Just one small example of what's possible when we bring technology and innovation to the forefront. The second issue, when we came into the executive office, Thomas Edison would still recognize our nation's electricity grid. It's shocking. Alexander Graham Bell would not recognize our cell phone industry or our telecommunications model, but Edison would. So the question was, what can we do to modernize the grid? And what benefits does this accrue to us? Well, the president put a Recovery Act investment. He put about $4.5 billion into the Recovery Act, and it was matched by the private sector. And so now we're accelerating the modernization of the grid. But one of the important things that's come out about this is that now we can start to learn how we each consume energy. Now, I get my electrical bill one value a month. My utility company tells me I consumed this many kilowatt hours, this is my rate, pay the bill. But if I wanted to know during the month, during the day, within the day, during hours, what was my consumption pattern? They wouldn't have that data, they wouldn't be able to share it with me. But in our modernized grid, that information is collected every 6 seconds. In California, there are literally tens of millions of homes that have these machines capable of calculating their energy usage. Now, prior to our involvement, that information was only held by the utility. We had a simple proposition. It's the customer's data. Let them have it. And let them have it in a form that they can spark a whole new industry of companies who can take that data from the customer and provide them really helpful tips to save money, to improve their lives. So we worked with the industry and we launched something called Green Button. And here's the pace of change. I issued a challenge to the utility sector in September of 2011, a year ago, basically today. Actually, it might even be a year ago today. And I issued them the following challenge. In 90 days, can we achieve consensus on what the file formats should be to provide customers electronic access to their file? Well, the 3 CIOs in California, the 3 big utilities, held a meeting in October, and I flew out there. We had a 5-hour meeting, and they ended the meeting with consensus and said, we will hit the goal. We will all implement the same standard, and by January they did. And now customers can download a little green button. And here's an example of what happens is when you do this, we announced this on a Wednesday. By Sunday, I was in New York at a Silicon Valley, Silicon Alley is the New York term, conference where they invited entrepreneurs to build products and services over a weekend. Over a dozen products were built in one weekend on the green button standard we just announced that Wednesday. Now here's where it gets really weird. At the Wednesday event, where we announced this, the representatives from PG&E were asked a question by the audience. They said, there are over 300 rate plans in California. It's kind of weird. You can choose whatever rate you want, variable rate, fixed rate, etc. How, as a customer, am I supposed to know what rate is the right one for me based on my usage? And her answer, the CIO, Karen Austin, said, we'll get to that problem a year from now. We're just thankful we were able to get this out the door. You know, that's a complicated problem. It's a lot of information to study. We haven't written those products for that. Sunday night it was built. An application called Watt Quiz. You upload your green button data. It queries the entire California rate structure. And this particular family would save 44% by switching to the E6 time of use rate plan over the default plan. What if you were told you could save 44% on your energy bill all along? You'd feel pretty empowered, wouldn't you? Well, with data, that's going to happen. The utility industry has now embraced this. Over 30 million households will have smart meters by the end of the year or over the next 2 years, and the utilities have pledged to ensure that those customers get green button. How much money did I pay the 3 utilities to adopt this standard? 0. What law did we pass to force them to do this? None. The power of impatient convening. It was the right thing to do. They exerted leadership. And of course, it was nice to have the president bring them to the Oval Office or the Roosevelt Room and thank them for their actions. But we can do that. I want to share with you the story of health information. This is my life's work prior to my tenure in public service. And I felt, and I still feel today, there's never been a better time to be an innovator than right now in healthcare. It's so funny. You read the papers and you think that like both parties couldn't be further apart on healthcare. Hogwash. They are 100% in alignment on this. To change the healthcare system for the better, we need to move the payment system to one that rewards value over volume. One of the things we like to do in the White House that you measure, kind of how successful you are at advocating your policies to the president is how often in the State of the Union he says things that you encourage him to say. So I had a great year in 2011. I had a number of sentences in the State of the Union. I was very excited about it. There was one sentence in particular that is the embodiment of the problem that this slide will help explain. It turns out that we were talking about the wireless potential in America. The president chose to say something on the order of, imagine a future where you could FaceTime video chat your doctor. He just added that little line in there. And the dirty little secret of that sentence is that if a doctor were to do that today in Little Rock, they would not get paid. In other words, think about everything you'd want to see fixed in American healthcare. 1 out of every 4 or 5 patients that's discharged from a hospital ends up right back in the hospital within 45 days because something fell off the wagon from the time they were discharged the first time and when they went back in. Wouldn't it be nice if there was a physician or a nurse assistant who could be in touch with that patient to make sure that everything was okay? Did they get their meds on time? Do they need to adjust their dosage and so forth? Wouldn't it be nice if there was folks proactively contacting patients? Well, that may be nice, but not reimbursable. It's more productive and more profitable for the hospital to see the patient admitted twice than it is to just spend a few dollars in between to make sure that everything's okay on their meds. We're going to move the care delivery system to pay for value. We don't know exactly what the future payment model should look like, but Congress did something unprecedented. They have delegated their power to micromanage the way doctors and hospitals get paid, which is what they do today. They've now delegated that to the Department of Health and Human Services. Right now, as we speak, any group of doctors and hospitals can petition the Department of Health and Human Services and say, we would like to be paid better. That is, more for keeping people healthier and so forth. I'll give you one little story about my own life in Virginia. I funded a little project. In fact, Arkansas is famous for this telemedicine program that you have Angels, Arkansas Angels, I think it's called. I forget. But it's a way to connect to reduce infant mortality rates. Well, we had a community in the Shenandoah Valley, which is a very, very rural part of the state. 16.9% of women give birth early. And they often end up in the neonatal intensive care unit. By the way, the national goal is to have no more than 7% of the mothers give birth early. So we're talking 17% to 7. We funded a small little project, a $100,000 project, to get UVA to communicate via telemedicine to those moms, and they cut preterm birth rates by 30% just by communicating to moms at the 12th week and having those moms show up at a federally qualified health center and follow up and comply. This initiative today has no reimbursement strategy, so it doesn't live past the grant. But in a pay-for-value model, each week we save of not having to put a child in the NICU is a $40,000 savings. Medicaid alone spends $15 million on neonatal intensive care at UVA dealing with those moms. So if we could cut 30%, those are a lot of savings. Savings that could be reinvested in helping those doctors get the equipment and the reimbursements they need to care for those moms, and still leave a lot left over for savings to bring down healthcare costs. But that's just policy. What are people inventing? I'm just going to share, out of all this, I'm going to share just 2 stories because they'll give you a sense for what's happening with entrepreneurs and innovators. We've opened up all of our healthcare data. Everything we as taxpayers have spent on, we've now put out in the public domain, health.data.gov. The first story is a story of an ER doctor called Dr. Peter Hudson, who came to visit me at the White House maybe 2.5 years ago. And he didn't have an ask. You know, normally people ask for meetings at the the White House, oh, would you support this provision or help me with this problem I'm dealing with? He just said, I'm this excited guy. I want to see patients get the care where they should get the care, not in the ER where they don't need to get the care. They can get care at urgent facilities. And I built this iPhone app. By the way, 6 million people have downloaded the thing. And I'd like to use it for good. Well, we we collaborated on this idea and said, hey, we have a list of every federally qualified health center in America. He loaded it into the system, and without any advertising, payments, requirements, he generated 76,000 referrals to folks who were naturally using his application for their own purpose, ending up going to a lower cost care setting based on their needs. This is an example of entrepreneurship and innovation. You wouldn't know the government brings you iTriage, because it didn't. The iTriage application is an entrepreneur, but it's powered with government data. By the way, if any of you consume the weather by watching the Weather Channel or AccuWeather, note that all of that multi-billion-dollar weather industry sources its information from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Second story I'll share with you is the story of Asmopolis. This is taking advantage of the GPS system. You all have smartphones where it's got the GPS, tells you where you are. Does anybody know what the GPS actually is and where it comes from? A couple of you, the military. President Ronald Reagan paid for these satellites to go in the air for our military to help with position, location. And under President Clinton, the decision was made to take off some of the filters. Reagan was initially worried if the private sector could see the same thing that the military sees, are we going to give up advantage? And it turns out we really weren't giving up much advantage. So in the Clinton administration, they said, you know what, we'll remove the filters so GPS can be hyper-precise. That's now a $90 billion industry of location-based services. Government data, private innovation. Well, Asmopolis did something fascinating. They put a GPS chip on the top of an asthma inhaler. Because if any of your kids suffer from asthma, the first thing you should know is the last time and location where their attack occurred. But no one actually has that stuff written down anywhere because it's just not the kind of thing you normally do. Well, the computer in this case tracks all that stuff. And a researcher from Madison, Wisconsin put this little application together, and in his first trial of 50 patients, he cut uncontrollable asthma 50% just by sharing back with the patient information about where they were when they had their last attack, so they could identify patterns and avoid them moving forward. Uncontrollable asthma is the third leading cause of admissions to the emergency room. Learning. Imagine a scenario where every teacher in America has the full power of the internet helping him or her personalize lesson plans for every child they teach. That future is in our grasp. And it starts with a very simple proposition. The internet is interesting, but it's a big mess of gobbledygook. Wouldn't it be great if there was an internet just for learning material? And wouldn't it even be greater if that learning material was rated or reviewed by peer teachers? In fact, wouldn't it be phenomenal if we could figure out, I'm struggling with my Hispanic majority classroom to explain the concept of gravity. Oh, Ms. Matthews from Little Rock, Arkansas, wrote a lesson plan that's had tremendous results on this same issue. Here it is. So we worked, Arnie Duncan and I announced the Open Education Data Initiative in January of this year, 2012. But it was built on a very simple concept. And one of those concepts is the idea of a learning registry. Here's how the registry works. It's the same exact point of green button. We didn't mandate this on anybody. We didn't pay for the private sector to adopt this. We said, let's get the government's house in order first. So we said, we in the National Science Foundation, NASA, DOD, Department of Education, we fund a lot of learning material. Let's create a 21st century card catalog and tag it on the internet. So in this particular example, if someone decides to search the registry for all the learning objects on the internet that happen to align with the standards for mathematics, you can search for it in a free tool that the Mozilla browser supports. You can see we just discovered a lesson plan by Kimberly Bauman, who is a teacher who describes her engineering course. You can see that her lesson plans map back to the Common Core, so if you're trying to figure out what we should do to improve our our performances in fractions and proportions, we can do so. And there's even a social media-like interface that would allow you to say, hey, the Mars rover video was just added to a lesson plan by an architecture and engineering teacher a few weeks back. This lightweight, simple, technical standard has been voluntarily adopted by Pearson, Houghton Mifflin, and the PBS Kids. There's a website they have for teachers. Again, opening up data and encouraging its use to create new products and services we've yet to imagine. I'm personally waiting on a GPS system. I have a kid that's in kindergarten. I'd love to figure out exactly what we should do to figure out, is my daughter on track or off track with what the school wants her to learn by this point? And if I know early enough, could I then intervene with supplemental learning materials to help keep her where she needs to be? A personalized learning experience for every child in America is in our grasps. Last, and certainly not least, it's this notion of digital infrastructure, going to get better, going to get better, going to get better. As I mentioned to you, the President signed into law the National Wireless Initiative. And this is my second trip on Air Force One, which was really awesome. We flew to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which is the, I guess in the glove or whatever it'd be at the top. And it turns out they had more snow days than school days in this particular community at Marquette. And as a result, they invested in wireless communications so that kids could stay in their neighboring school and beam into other classrooms if they couldn't make it to, in this case, at the top of the hill. So the president went and visited and talked to the kids at the neighboring schools to talk about the power of mobile broadband as the third wave of economic growth on the internet. And you're starting to see this have even bigger impact. Cleveland, the university called Case Western Reserve, adopted 100 of the poorest homes next to the campus, and they retrofitted the home with 1 gigabit broadband and decided to allow what would happen if the poorest of the poor had access to the most impressive broadband speeds in the world. What new innovative applications and products could we deploy? And we've seen improvements in healthcare and energy and a whole range of educational applications. They're just being piloted in that little community. America will invent the gigabit internet economy, again, through public-private partnership. I want to end with this final observation, and that final observation is, it's not so much technology as an end of itself, but rather its application to solve the big challenges of our day. And one of the foundational elements is that we have a community of folks in this country who understand the possibilities. So we don't get stuck saying, this thing costs $1,000. I want American taxpayers to subsidize it to make it free, or no, everybody should pay the $1,000. And this ideological fight breaks out. What if we could invent a $100 alternative? We would lower the need for subsidy if we go that route, or we'd make it more accessible and affordable for folks who can get there. We can come together as a country by saying, let's invent the $100 substitute. We do this in technology. The products get cheaper, they get better, they get faster. We don't do this in problem solving and public policy. We do now. I end with the notion that we got to make sure we pay specific attention to the skills we need as a country to be able to answer these questions. And to me, it lies in the expression STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And to be more precise, it's the ET of STEM. We have science and math, and we have lots of courses you could take about this, but we don't do as much in this country talking about the ET, the engineering and the technology, the problem solving, the tinkering, the designing, the making. I would humbly suggest that it's our imperative as leaders to get back the process of turning our country into a nation of ETs, of makers, of doers, of builders, and designers. And one way we're doing this is through NASA. We've opened up all of our modeling and simulation techniques and lesson plans. They're all freely available, open source. Anybody can play, participate. You can use any one of a number of devices to access it. We're just getting started on this journey. And I'm hopeful more leaders that graduate from this terrific school will participate in this third leg of the policymaking stool, because I think it holds the greatest prospects for restoring that faith in American democracy, that we can tackle these problems and prepare ourselves, as the President said out there, a bridge to the 21st century economy. With that, thank you so much for hearing me.
All right, we've got time for some questions. If you would raise your hands, then we would get the microphone to you. Surely with all these technology experts, Dr. Mehta, let's get you right there.
And tell me your name.
My name is Jay Mehta.
Thank you, Jay.
Very nice presentation, very unusual for this kind of audience. We really enjoyed it. Let me ask you a simple question. We are the inventors of internet, but I don't know how many in the audience know we have slower speeds than in many other countries in the world, and we pay almost 5 to 10 times as much for accessing technology as other countries. Wouldn't making it cheaper make it more useful, more attractive, and probably help everything else that you said?
So
first, maybe you can go into the reasons why it is more expensive and slower.
Yeah, so first question is the nature of the telecommunications market in America, how we price for the value we receive. I will not pass judgment on how we got here, but I will describe for you my model of invention to solve this moving forward. The President, in this wireless initiative that was one of my most important projects and assignments, offered up the following analogy. In today's wireless arena, imagine a road where each lane was dedicated to only Honda cars, GM cars in one lane, Ford cars in the middle lane, and so forth. If a highway was designed that way, I guess technically speaking you'd be safe, because a GM car would never hit a Ford car because they're each in their separate lanes. But you'd find lots of inefficiency in the use of the asset that is the highway, because not every minute is there going to be a car of just that manufacturer. In fact, you might be sort of frustrating. You might have a traffic jam in the GM lane, and you're looking over there at the Ford lane, and it's kind of empty. You're like, geez, why can't I just go over to the Ford lane and get through? That's broadband in America. So I happen to have an AT&T phone, and when things get congested on my AT&T phone, I just lose service. But the Verizon phone and the Sprint phone, they're operating in the airwaves right next to me, and sometimes they're clear and open and they can move forward. One of the key principles of spectrum policy that the President has ushered in is a shift in technology opportunities from one in which we're always debating should the carriers get a subsidy and what's the right subsidy amount in order to get the price to be affordable and reaching out to the most audiences. Instead, what if we optimized the assets of our country? The one thing about rural America, and Virginia has a lot of rural America in it, a friend of mine said, this is not my quote, rural America is the Saudi Arabia of spectrum. Because we got a lot of empty airwaves, not a lot of stuff flying through the air. The president said we should be the first in the world to take full advantage of spectrum sharing technologies to usher in a new round of competition and creativity in this mobile broadband era. So I would rather fight we put $100 million of R&D into wireless technologies as part of the wireless initiative. I'd rather put a small pennies of R&D into thinking about spectrum sharing technologies and encouraging more competition, more innovation, which will naturally bring prices down and competition and carrier service up, rather than having a huge fight over whether the cable monopoly or the telecom monopoly is subsidized at the right level or is efficiently run enough to bring low-cost, better service. That's just my philosophy in terms of thinking about innovation, and my encouragement would be to the folks in the university downtown, if there is a group of folks thinking about wireless, what would it take to make Little Rock a test bed? I'm going to make rural Virginia a test bed. Why can't you fight to be a test bed and bring those entrepreneurs and shared spectrum technologists into the region? That's how I would approach the issue. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, right here. Microphone's coming.
Okay, Gordon Apple with Ed for You. And by the way, you asked for the connection. I'm an engineer, work for TRW on MX missiles and all kinds of things.
So you know the DoD
using
side of
GPS. So
Yes, sir.
know what that's about. Okay, the model you're talking about, though, it has to have some kind of a management system. Somebody has to manage the spectrum, and then you can have individual companies offering services through that.
Yeah.
I wonder if the model is more like that of Utopia. You familiar with that?
I am familiar with it.
In
It's-
Utah,
So
along I-15?
Yeah, so the discussion here is the big fight in the 1990s is should a government or a government nonprofit affiliate own the pipe and then invite competitors to use that pipe for service.
Yeah, because you have a lot of waste in the spectrum now. You look at
Correct.
DirecTV and Dish Network, total
Correct.
duplication of the spectrum.
Correct.
XM and Sirius were two separate companies. Even though they're
Correct.
together, they're still maintaining incompatible
Systems.
parallel systems. Complete waste of spectrum.
So the issue is our underlying architecture still is built, so there's Utopia was an in-ground fiber network. The wireless components of it are, as you describe, the frequencies are pretty much allocated. It's like a zoning map for a beachfront property. 50 years ago, we decided this is how we should carve up the territory. And so people have kind of built up in their silos, and they haven't been able to like accumulate multiple lots and tear everything down and build one big skyscraper. So what we're saying is, as we move forward, the commercial sector has licensed the spectrum, so they have it. But there's a lot of government-held spectrum that hasn't been put to commercial use. And so what the president's order was, I want to take a fresh look. Can we use a sharing model so that let me give you an example. The Mars Curiosity rover that you know, I think the math is something like for 15 minutes a day, they're aligned with the satellites to beam the signal back. But for 23 hours and 45 minutes, it's dead. NASA's holding the spectrum, but no one's using it for anything else. So if I could create a really cool music app that I want to use for 23 hours and 45 minutes, and it just goes off when the Curiosity rover is beaming back, that service might be appealing to me. Or more likely, and that was your point about, is there a manager? Our theory is there's going to be these new databases that show up. So the machines are going to say, let me check that signal, and if it's interference, I'm going to switch signals, try something else, something else, something else, and I'll keep trying until I find an empty signal, and then I'll patch the message through. This is a little bit more science-y, fiction-y stuff. This is not here today, but we're positioning ourselves for that future with research investments, because I personally believe We haven't yet realized the full economic value of the internet, and this is a wave. This location-based mobile wave is a huge growth opportunity for us. Yes, sir.
Jerry.
One of the things that you were faced with at the White House was trying to get the federal bureaucracy to change, and
Yes.
change quite rapidly. Could you share with us some of the strategies that you've been able to find success in moving bureaucracy forward?
So well, there's a couple of techniques that are fun. It starts with a fundamental motivation. As every student at the School of Public Service here will tell you, they have a mission and a passion to solve something. Their mission and passion isn't like authorization bills and budget fights. You know, it's, I want to solve a thing. I want housing prices affordable. I want energy more ubiquitous. The underlying motivation is something we decided to tap into. So what President Obama invited us to do is open up these new websites, let the employees submit ideas, vote on each other's ideas up and down, and then build small coalitions to say, we want to move this given idea forward, and honor them and reward them, not smack them down, especially if those ideas can be done within existing authorities and without additional taxpayer burdens. So number one, we knew we could tap into their creativity. That gave us a bolus of support. Number two, I had to work to provide air cover. So my favorite example on air cover was a team of people at the VA and HHS said, in the same way I said the Green Button Initiative, Americans deserve electronic copies of our own healthcare data. We call that the Blue Button file. And the DOD and the VA have spent billions of dollars trying to interconnect the VA and the DOD health systems so that you'd have one file if you're a veteran. Well, the entrepreneurs said to us, don't bother closing the internal connections. That's going to take forever. Give a copy to the patient and let there be a new industry formed around helping the patient. Well, the team was ready to go there, but it was too crazy for the kind of formal structures to adopt it. So one of the things that I had the pleasure of doing is working with the president's speechwriters and policy staff to say, maybe if the president said to the veterans, I want to have a blue button, he'll create air cover. So he did. August of 2010, he's announcing the end of the combat mission in Iraq. Pretty big speech. And we insert this line that he was really excited to say that says, and this fall, I will give veterans a blue button that they can push so they can download their personal health records, do with it what they wish, share it with whomever they want. And that was enough air cover to get the employees all fired up. Wow, the president said, blue button, let's make this happen. 1 million veterans, active duty military, Medicare beneficiaries have all pushed that blue button in the last year and a half. And it was a 90-day challenge that the president issued. So air cover, tap into the bottom, and then my final comment about change. We are experimenting with forming what we call lean startup teams. We did 2 before I left, and now we've got 5 more. We've invited entrepreneurs from the private sector to spend 3 to 6 months on a specific assignment, fix this one thing, and paired them up one by one with employees in the bureaucracy that they're adopting to invent a better way. So we're doing an innovation pathway with the Food and Drug Administration to get medical devices to market faster. We're doing something with the Immigration Department to make it easier for entrepreneurs to get a visa. And we just announced 5 other initiatives in healthcare, energy, education, and the like. And we call them Presidential Innovation Fellows. And we just announced the first class a few weeks ago.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for
being
having me.
here. Thank you very much.